Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Ashrafil Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In last week's lesson, we concluded by looking at the mas'ala or the ruling with regards to nikah-e-muta, and I mentioned that this is something which, according to the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, is something which is haram, it's a form of prostitution, whereas according to the Shias, not only do they say nikah-e-muta is jaiz or permissible, but they actually say that it's one of the aham tareen ibadats, i.e. it's a very, very good ibadat, a very, very good worship to carry out nikah-e-muta. So the dalails and the evidence for both the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah and what the Shia say was looked at in last week's lesson. Now in this week's lesson, we're going to move along with the next part of the nikah and the marriage, and that is the issue of marrying more than once. And also we're going to touch on the issue of why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam have more than one wife. And also at the same time, we'll be looking at another question which people raise about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's nikah and marriage, and that is that why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marry Hazrat Aisha radhiyallahu anha, bearing in mind that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married her, she was 6 years old, and the consummation of the marriage, i.e. the rukhsati of the marriage, took place when Hazrat Aisha radhiyallahu anha was 9 years old. Now the first rule to clarify here is, according to the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that a man is allowed to have 4 wives at any one time. Obviously he could get married as however many times he wants, in terms of, just say for example, if he marries one, then divorces, gets married again. So he could have, say, he could be involved in 10 marriages, 20 marriages, that's okay. But at any one time, in his nikah, in his marriage, the most and the maximum he's allowed to have is 4 wives. And it is also the ruling of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and this is also mentioned in the Holy Quran as well, that a woman is only allowed to have one husband at any one time. So basically, there's no such thing as a woman having 4 husbands. That's not allowed. A man can have 4 wives at any one time, but what the woman is not allowed to have is have 4 husbands at any one time. This is something which is haram and lawful. Now let's have a look at the issue of polygamy, and again this is something which many people raise this objection, that why does Islam allow polygamy? And also at the same time they say that, well, if Islam is about the religion of equal rights and equal responsibilities, then if it's permissible for men to have 4 wives, then why isn't it permissible for women to have 4 husbands? Now let me explain a few points here. Number one is that polygamy, or the issue of having more than one wife, is something which was found in other religions. When you look through history, you'll find that in Christianity, in Judaism, and in other religions, they would have more than one wife. When we look through the history of Arabia during the days of ignorance, the Zaman-e-Jahiliyyah, you will find many stories of the leaders of the Quraysh having more than one wife. So having more than one wife is not something which was considered wrong or impermissible or something strange, during Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time or in the early part of Islam. But when we look at it, Islam is the only religion where it's actually put a maximum number of how many wives you can have. In other religions, you will find that their leaders or their people or their kings, they would have 50 wives, they would have 100 wives. But Islam is the only religion where it's actually put a limit there, that you can have 4 wives, but that's it, that's the maximum. You can't have more than 4. Other religions, it was like, all for everyone. If you want 100 wives, you can have. If you want 200 wives, you can. There wasn't actually any limit to it. However, Islam is the only religion where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Sharia has put a limit that the maximum you can have is 4, and that's it. So that's one point to remember. The second point to remember here, or our second reply, is that polygamy is something, or having more than one wife is something which is mubah and something which is permissible in Islam. It's not something which is like lazim or something which is like farz, that as soon as you convert to Islam, then that's it, you're going to have 4 wives. No, it's not something like that. It's something which is mubah, something which is permissible, and something which is mubah and permissible if you can do insaf between the wives. Many people think, in particular when you speak to non-Muslims, they think that, oh, if you convert to Islam, you automatically you have 4 wives. That's like the rule, that you're going to have 4 wives. No, it's not the rule. It's not the norm. You only can have more than 1 wife, 2 wives, 3 wives, 4 even, as long as you can do insaf. That's the key word, insaf, adl. As long as you can do justice. Because there are many hadiths of Sunan al-Tirmizi, Sunan Abu Dawood, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that that person who had 2 wives and he didn't do insaf between them, then what would happen is that he will come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter, and one of his side will be paralyzed. So it's not something, many people think that, oh, it's just fun having 2 wives, 3 wives and so on. It's only mubah. What I mean by mubah is that mubah literally means is something permissible, meaning you're not going to get extra reward. Having a second wife, you're not going to get extra reward for that. It's just something permissible, i.e. you're allowed to do. It's not like haram, but you're allowed to do it. So it's not like, say for example, you have to get married 4 times. It's not something which you're going to get extra reward or thawab for. It's something which the Sharia has allowed and has permitted. That's what we mean by mubah. So that's the second point to remember, is that having more than 1 wife is not something which the Sharia is encouraging. Something is not saying that you have to do when you convert to Islam, but it's something which is mubah and permissible. And the third point to remember why Islam allows polygamy or allows a man or a husband to have more than 1 wife is that this is a fact of life, that women, they tend to live longer than men. Generally speaking, obviously, if Allah wills, we could die whenever. Women can die in their childbirth, women can die in their teenage years. But generally speaking, women, they tend to have longer life than men. And also this is fact as well, that there are more women than men in this dunya. Now in this dunya, in this world, if you look at the population of every single country, you will find that there are more women than men. Now, when we look at it, if there are more women than men, that obviously is telling us that there will be so many women who will not have husbands. Because obviously, women, if there are so many, then they're not going to have husbands, because obviously there's only certain percentage of men. So then that leads to 2 possibilities. Because women, they also have desires as well. As mentioned in a hadith of, I think top of my head, Kanzul Ummal, where closest meaning to the hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that women have more desires than men. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put the parda of haya on them. That's why they don't show their desires in, or they don't indulge in their desires in a wrong or unlawful way. But women also have desires as well. So now there's 2 ways they need to fulfill their desires. Now there are 2 ways now they can fulfill it. Either, na'udhu billah, you tell them, okay, you could have boyfriends. You could tell them you could, like, stand in the corner streets and wait for men to pick you up and they'll fulfill your desires. Go to bars, go to clubs, and men will fulfill your desires. That's one way. Or the second way, which Islam chooses, which is a more chaste way, a more pak daman way, is that they get married. So they get married to a man who's already married. So i.e. this particular woman or sister becomes the second wife of the husband, or a third wife, or a 4th wife, and in this particular way her desires are fulfilled, and it is fulfilled in a halal and lawful way rather than in a unlawful, in a haram way. So that in a nutshell is the issue of polygamy, and why Islam says that it is permissible for men to have more than 1 wife. Now turning the tables, as I explained before, that you get some people who say that, well, if men are allowed to have 4 wives, then why can't women have 4 husbands? They say that Islam is about equal rights and so on. So then that should mean that women are allowed or should have 4 husbands. Now the reason why the Sharia does not allow the women to have 4 husbands is, there's a few reasons, 2 main reasons I'm just going to mention. Number 1 is that, just say for argument's sake, if the wife or the woman had 4 husbands, and if that woman fell pregnant, then we would not know who the father of the child is. Now obviously you may argue and say, well, DNA and so on. Well, in Islam, DNA is not a legal hujjah. It's not like a basis, it's not like evidence which you can use to derive the paternity of a child. So basically, the first problem you'll have if a woman was to have more than 1 husband, 2 husbands, 3 husbands, is that if she was to fall pregnant, then who's the father of this child? The lineage, the nasab of this father, of this child, would get then mixed up between 3 possible husbands or between 3 possible men. So that's one reason. And the second reason why the Sharia doesn't allow women having more than 1 husband is because there is a risk of diseases, sexual diseases such as AIDS and HIV. Because again, when you look through medical science, they'll tell you that if a woman has more than 1 sexual partner, she's more likely to catch AIDS and HIV and so on. So because of that's the second reason why the Sharia obviously doesn't allow women to have more than 1 husband or to have more than 1 sexual partner, because of this particular reason. And also there's the issue of haya and modesty as well, that women naturally, they don't want to have more men and so on. So because of these 2-3 reasons, the Sharia totally bans and prohibits women at any one time to have more than 1 husband. But obviously the other way around, it is permissible for men to have more than 1 wife. That is something which is allowed and permissible in the Sharia. Now moving along to the next part of the talk, is we mentioned that it is permissible for a husband to have 4 wives. Now this then leads us on to the next point regarding why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam have more than 4 wives, and what was the wisdom or the hikmah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam having more than 4 wives or marrying so many times. Now just a couple of points to remember before we look at this particular answer. The majority of the scholars of the view that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had, or he got married 11 times. So basically he had 11 wives. And when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, then 9 of his wives were alive. So basically when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, 9 of his wives were alive. So 2 of them had already passed away, and they were, number 1, Khadija radhiyallahu anha, and number 2 was Hazrat Zainab bint Khuzaymah radhiyallahu anha. So they were the 2 wives who passed away. But obviously Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in total he had 11 wives. In some books they'll say that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had 13 wives. Now the reason why they've said 13 is because they've actually included 2 of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's slave girls. One was Maria Qibtiyya radhiyallahu anha, and the other one was called Rayhana. They've included them to be the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because there are some narrations or some opinions who say that Maria Qibtiyya radhiyallahu anha was also one of the Azwaj Mutahharat. She was also one of the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But as I explained, the majority of scholars say that no, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had 11 wives, and that Maria Qibtiyya radhiyallahu anha and Rayhana, they were his slave girls and not his wife. Now this then takes us on to the next point, is why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam have so many wives? Okay, we've said 4 times, fair enough. Why didn't Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam just marry 4? Why was there a 5th, a 6th, 7, all the way until 11 times? Now there's a few reasons why. Number 1, the first reason is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his entire life, from even before prophethood as well, because when we look through his seerah, even before prophethood, you won't find any blemish in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's character. There was no one accused Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam of dishonesty, lying, deceiving. Even before prophethood, no accounts you'll find of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam worshipping idols, anything like that. So from the moment Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born all the way until Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's death, every single lamha of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life was a example for us. It's like a role model for us. Now similarly, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he married so many times. Why? To give us a role model, to give us some examples of how to live with a life. How to live with a wife. Now let me give you an example. What I mean by that is, beginning Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married Hazrat Khadija radhiyallahu anha, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was with Khadija radhiyallahu anha, i.e. the nikah, for a good 25 years of his life. So that was an example of how to live with just one wife. How to behave with when you just have one wife. How to behave with a wife who is older than you. So that's like one example. Then later on, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married more women to show to the Muslims, to show to his believers, the Sahabas, that this is how you should behave when you have more women, when you have more wives. Similarly, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he didn't just like marry all the time young girls or young women. He married women from different backgrounds, from different age structures, such as Hazrat Aisha anha, when he got married to her, she was very, very young. Khadija anha, when he married her, she was very old. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't just marry virgins, he also married widows. He also married, like for example, women who had already been divorced from another husband. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married different women from different age groups, from different age categories, from different backgrounds, as we're going to look at later with Hazrat Safiya and Hazrat Juwayriya. So from different backgrounds, to show to the people that this is how you behave as a husband. This is how you're supposed to be as a husband. Look, if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, say Nauzubillah, had just married young girls, virgins, then somebody could then argue and say, well, Nauzubillah, Rasulullah sallallahu nikah was for fulfilling lust and desires. No. When we look at it, it wasn't lust and desire. If it was lust and desire, he would have just married young girls, and all his wives would have been just young brides, young girls in their teens or in their early 20s who are very, very pretty and so on. No, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married women from different age groups. Some were divorcees, some were widows from other marriages, from different backgrounds, not just Arabs, from different backgrounds as well, so that to show to people that this is how a husband should behave when he's with one wife or when he has many wives. This is how you should live. So that's one reason of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marrying so many times. Another reason of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam having so many wives is ta'liman lil ummah, i.e. to teach the ummah and to educate the ummah and his people. Now you may be thinking that, don't you have the sahabas, the male sahabas and companions to teach the ummah? No. There are certain things which men would not, or sahabas, close sahabas like say as Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu, as Umar radhiyallahu anhu, would not have known about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now what I mean by that is, say for example, issues relating to home. How Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was at home. Now Hazrat Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu wouldn't have known that because he's not living with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at home. Hazrat Umar radhiyallahu anhu wouldn't have known that. Even the Ashab Suffa, who were actually who were in the masjid, learning the Quran, learning the hadith, interpretation of the Quran and hadith, like Hazrat Abu Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu, they wouldn't have known how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam behaves at home. Even like say for example, imams and scholars, in front of people we seem like religious and pious, but how do we know at home, what kind of people we are? Only Allah knows. So similarly, how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was at home, only the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam could derive. And that's why there's that very famous hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, where one of the Sahabas asking Hazrat Aisha anha that how was Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at home. They didn't go to Hazrat Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu, Hazrat Umar. They asked Hazrat Aisha anha, and then Hazrat Aisha anha explained that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was like an ordinary person at home. He would like mend his shoes, he would like do the jaru and so on. This was how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was at home. Now obviously Hazrat Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu wouldn't have been able to narrate that. Hazrat Umar radhiyallahu anhu would not have been able to narrate that, but he has to be a wife, someone very close to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam who would be able to narrate something like that. And that's not all. Other issues as well, such as rulings about haze, periods, istihada, nifas, that can only be narrated by women. Obviously men do not go through those situations, so they're not going to be able to know what kind of questions to ask. So obviously Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha, the other wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Salama radiallahu anha, Hazrat Zainab bint Jahsh radiallahu anha, they were able to ask these kind of questions. Even other things as well about, when a woman is on a period, then what can the husband do to fulfill his desires and so on. So again, this is not something you'll find a male Sahaba or a companion narrating it. And the hadith which you can find, say in Sahih al-Bukhari, is actually narrated by Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha, where she explains that when I would be on my period, then this is how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would fulfill his desires with me. So all these things can only be narrated by women, by azwaj mutahharat, by those who are with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that's like another wisdom or hikmah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marrying more than once or having more than 4 wives. Now another reason, number 3, why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam conducted so many marriages and so many nikahs is to eliminate tribal distinctions. That tribal distinctions meaning like asabiyat. Like obviously in those days there were a lot of like tribal passion, a lot of tribal pride and arrogance. You had the Quraysh, and then in Makkah you had the Aus and the Khazraj. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam conducted nikah with different women from different tribes, so to eliminate that particular asabiyya and that particular tribal pride. An example we can see is of when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married Hazrat Safiya radiallahu anha, which I explained in last week's lesson that she was one of those who were in the fort in Khaybar. So when Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu conquered that particular fort, then Hazrat Safiya radiallahu anha, who was the daughter of Huway bin Akhtab, he was the leader of Banu Nazir, who were exiled from Medina Munawwara. They went to Khaybar. So now when she came into Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's share as a prisoner of war, then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam freed her and he got married to her. Now Hazrat Safiya radiallahu anha, she was a Jew, like she was from a Jewish background. Her lineage goes all the way up to Hazrat Harun alayhi salam. So she was a Jewish girl, a Jewish woman. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't just like conduct nikah with just Arabs or just with the Quraysh girls, but instead he got married to women from other tribes to show that this is also permissible as well. This is something which I explained before, that okay, fair enough, we tend to get married within for more like togetherness and so on. But again, if somebody was to get married outside, in terms of you got married to a Pakistani girl or a Bengali girl or an Arab girl and so on, then there's nothing wrong with that. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam demonstrated it with his own practice and action, that he didn't just get married to Arabs or to girls or women from the Quraysh. He got married to, you could say a Jewish girl is an example of a revert. Someone who was a Jewish woman before and then she converted to Islam. So example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marrying reverts. And there's some other reasons why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam conducted so many nikahs, such as like for example to show the status of a divorced woman. Okay, unfortunately nowadays what happens is that when a girl or a sister is divorced, then nauzubillah, people think of her to be like used goods, in terms of they don't want to get married to her again. So then that bichari, that woman then remains single for the rest of her life. No one wants to get married to her. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam got married. Many of his marriages were with women who were either divorced or who were widows, to show that nauzubillah, they're not something like used goods. You can still get married to them, and it's permissible to get married to them and so on. So there's many reasons why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam got married. Some other example could be for political reasons as well, why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam conducted many nikahs. And a good example of that is when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married Hazrat Juwayriyah radiallahu anha. Juwayriyah radiallahu anha, she was the daughter of the leader of Banu Mustalaq. So basically when that particular battle happened, so Hazrat Juwayriyah radiallahu anha, she came in as she was a prisoner of war, and she came in the hissa of a sahabi in the name of Thabit bin Qais radiallahu anhu. Hissa meaning like, when the booty was distributed. So Hazrat Juwayriyah radiallahu anha, she was like a prisoner of war. So she came in the hissa, or in the share of Thabit bin Qais radiallahu anhu. So as the hadith mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari, that the Sahaba said to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that Juwayriyah, she's not fit for Thabit bin Qais radiallahu anhu, she's more befitting of you. So then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam called back Thabit bin Qais radiallahu anhu. He gave Thabit bin Qais radiallahu anhu some other slave girls, and in return he asked for Juwayriyah radiallahu anha, and then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam freed Hazrat Juwayriyah, and then he got married to her. And that's why it's mentioned that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam got married to Hazrat Juwayriyah radiallahu anha, the Sahabas who had already received like slaves and slave girls from Banu Mustalaq, they freed every single one of them, and they said that because Juwayriyah had married you, I Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there is now a rishta, there are in-laws. So how can we have the in-laws of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in our possession? How can the in-laws of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam be our gulams, be our bandis and slave girls? So therefore the Sahabas, they freed every single one of them. And that's why it's mentioned in a hadith of Sunan Abu Dawud that Hazrat Aisha Anha would say that I have never come across a woman who had done so much for her people, i.e. Juwayriyah anha, because when she got married to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because of that nikah and that ta'alluq, her entire qawm, i.e. Banu Mustala, they all became freed, all their belongings got back together again. So this was because of Hazrat Juwayriyah, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marrying her. Now just very quickly moving on to the next point about Hazrat Aisha anha's nikah. Now, as I was explaining before, as mentioned the hadith, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha when she was 6 years old. So the actual nikah took place when she was 6. And this nikah took place before migration. So it actually took place in Makkah Mukarramah soon after when Hazrat Khadija anha passed away. And the rukhsati, i.e. the consummation of the marriage, took place when Hazrat Aisha anha was 9 years old. And this happened when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrated to Medina Munawwara. And then the hadith goes on to say that Hazrat Aisha anha was 18 when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away. And then Hazrat Aisha anha then lived, obviously single, all the way up to 66 years old when she passed away. Now obviously when people look at this hadith, as a very famous hadith, is found in more or less all the books of hadith, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmizi. They look at this hadith and they say, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married a girl of 6 years old. How can that be possible? Because obviously they look at it, according to the halat and the situation of this day and age, that a child bride, a girl of 6, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at that time was approximately 54 years old. How did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marry a girl who's only 6 years old? So people, they find it really difficult to believe. Now obviously initially this was something which non-Muslims would object, that how can Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marry a girl who's only 6 years old? But unfortunately nowadays you get many Muslims kind of raising objections. They say, oh, how can Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marry someone who's 6 years old? So and remember, having any doubt about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's seerah, about his wives, about anything about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is very dangerous. Why? Because it can take you out of the fold of Islam. So as I was saying, this was objection which non-Muslims would raise. Nowadays you get many Muslims, they'll raise these objections as well. Nowadays you get many Muslims, they actually think of masajid to be like a terrorist place. They think, you become terrorists when you come to these talks and these lectures and so on. So this is how unfortunately many Muslims are nowadays. Like we run a maktab in the evening. So one of the parents, he said, oh, I don't want my child to be Al-Qaeda here in the maktab. So so then he took him out. So this is how people's mentality is nowadays. So basically this, you get Muslims, they kind of object as well. They say that, oh, how can Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam marry a girl who's only 6 years old? Now let me just explain a few reasons regarding this particular nikah. Now the first reason why all Muslims should believe in is that first and foremost, this nikah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with Hazrat Aisha anha at the age of 6 was an order from Allah. Okay, so that's first thing. So whatever it's an order from Allah, we have to believe it. Amanna saddaqna. So it was an order from Allah. And this can clearly be seen in a hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari, where, as you know, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, before he got married to Hazrat Aisha anha, he had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a kind of picture being brought to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then opened the picture, and it was the face of Hazrat Aisha anha. And then it was said to, then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that, okay, if it was meant to happen, then it will happen. So first and foremost, what we can derive is that the nikah of Hazrat Aisha anha with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a divine inspiration. It was from Allah. Okay, so that's one thing, and we have to believe in that. That's number one. Number two, the second point here is that Hazrat Aisha anha, when she did get married to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the age of 6, but remember consummation, the marriage took place at the age of 9, she was fit for marriage. Meaning, in other words, she had reached the age of puberty. And again, there's a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari where it's got the words that when Hazrat Aisha anha, when she was now leaving her house and was now going to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's clearly got the words that she was ill and that her hair was falling off. Now, from the word she was ill, the scholars have said that illness here was referring to her periods that just started. Because obviously when a girl has periods for the very first time, it's a bit painful for her. So this hadith here of Sahih al-Bukhari quite clearly saying that when she did go to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's house, obviously the rukhsati, she had already reached the age of puberty, her menses, her period had started, so she was already fit for marriage. And obviously when a woman obviously starts a period and so on, so obviously she's qabil of getting married, she's okay for getting married and so on. And some of the reasons why like Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married Hazrat Aisha anha at such a young age is, as I explained before, ta'liman al-ummah, to educate the ummah, because many hadiths which we can find in our Sahih al-Bukhari, not just about Gharilu matters like household issues, about how to live with a wife and so on, but other kind of things about knowledge, about tahara, how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would pray tahajjud. When you look at the chapter about tahajjud in all the books of hadith, most of the hadiths are narrated by Hazrat Aisha anha, because obviously she would observe when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would wake up, what time he would wake up, how many rakats he would pray, when would he pray his witr, everything. So all that can be narrated by Hazrat Aisha anha, because she was very young, she was very keen, she had a very good memory, she was also a hafiz as well, she also memorized the Quran. So so this marriage was done, as I said, a divine inspiration, and a main hikmah and wisdom behind that was that she can then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose her to then convey the deen, to convey the hadith and the narrations of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to the generations afterwards. Because after, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, we find many stories of sahabas and tabi'ins who would come to Hazrat Aisha anha and they would ask her questions about this hadith, this particular issue and so on. You'll find that again in many books of hadith of that. So these are a few reasons why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married Hazrat Aisha anha at such a young age. Allah gives tawfiq to us, has been said, wa akhiru da'wana.